Hi Bryce, Nana here. We have a new story today. We're on chapter 18 and the story is called Cindy. There's the picture. And everybody's here joining me in the living room. This is kind of an experiment. I don't know if it's going to work or not, but we're going to try. And if not, then I'm going to stop the video and then we can resume it so you could listen to it in 2 steps. All right, Cindy. The name was on the garden gate, Lilac Cottage. I pulled out my list of visits and checked my entry again. Cook, Lilac, Cottage, Marston Hall. The female dog was overdue for whelping. This was the place, all right. Standing in the grounds of the hall, a 19th century mansion house whose rounded turrets reared above the fringe of the pine trees less than half a mile away. The door was opened by a heavy-featured dark woman of about 60 who regarded me unsmilingly. "Good morning, Mrs. Cook," I said. "I've come to see your dog." She still didn't smile. "Oh, very well. You'd better come in." She led me into the small living room, and as the little Yorkshire Terrier jumped down from an armchair, her manner changed. "Come here, Cindy, my darling," she cooed. "This gentleman's come to make you better." She bent down and stroked the little animal, her face radiant with affection. I sat down in another armchair. "Well, what's the trouble, Mrs. Cook?" "Oh, I'm worried to death," she clasped her hands anxiously. "She should have had her pups yesterday, and there's nothing happening. Oh, couldn't sleep all night. I'd die if something happened to the dog." I looked at the terrier, tail wagging, gazing up, bright-eyed, under her mistress's caress. "She doesn't seem distressed at all. Has she shown any signs of labor?" "What do you mean?" "Well, has she been panting or uneasy in any way? Is there any discharge?" "No, nothing like that." I beckoned to Cindy, who spoke to her, and she came timidly across the lino till I was able to lift her onto my lap. I palpated the distended abdomen. There was a lot of pups in there, but everything appeared normal. I took her temperature, normal again. "Bring me some warm water and soap, Mrs. Cook, will you please?" I said. The terrier was so small that I had to use my little finger, soaped and disinfected, to examine her, and as I felt carefully forward, the walls were dry and clinging to the cervix when I reached it tightly closed. I washed and dried my hands. "This little doggie isn't anywhere near whelping. Mrs. Cook, are you sure you haven't got your dates wrong?" "No, I haven't. It was 63 days yesterday." She paused and thought for a moment. "Now, I'd better tell you this, young man. Cindy's had pups before, and she did self the same thing. Wouldn't get on with the job. That was 2 years ago when I was living over in Listondale. I got Mr. Broomfield, the vet, to her, and he just gave her an injection. It was wonderful. She had her pups half an hour after it." I smiled. "Yes, that would be Pituitrin. Well, she must have been actually whelping when Mr. Broomfield saw her. Well, whatever it was, young man, I'd wish you'd give her some now. I can't stand all this suspense." "I'm sorry." I lifted Cindy from my lap and stood up. "I can't do that. It would be very harmful at this stage." She stared at me, and it struck me that dark face could look very forbidding. "So you're not going to do anything at all?" "Well, there are times when it is soothing procedure to give a client something to do, if it is unnecessary. Yes, I've got some tablets in the car. They'll help to keep the little dog fit until she whelps. But I'd far rather have that injection. It was just a little prick. Didn't take Mr. Broomfield more than a second to do." "I assure you, Mrs. Cook, it can't be done at the moment. I'll get the tablets from the car." Her mouth tightened. I could see she was grievously disappointed in me. "Oh, well, if you won't, you won't, so you better get them things." She paused. "And me name isn't Cook." "It isn't?" "No, it isn't, young man." She didn't seem disposed to offer further information, so I left in some bewilderment. Out on the road, a few yards from my car, a farm man was trying to start a tractor. I called over to him. "Hey, the lady in there says her name isn't Cook." "She's right and all. She's the cook over at the hall. You've gotten a bit mixed up." He laughed heartily. It all became suddenly clear. The entry in the day book Everything. What's her right name, then? Booby, he shouted just as the tractor roared into life. Funny name, I thought, as I produced my harmless vitamin tablets from the boot and returned to the cottage. Once inside, I did my best to put things right with plenty of yes, Mrs. Booby, and no, Mrs. Booby, but the lady didn't thaw. I told her not to worry and that I was sure nothing would happen for several days, but I could tell I wasn't impressing her. I waved cheerfully as I went down the path. Goodbye, Mrs. Booby, I cried. Don't hesitate to ring me if you're in doubt about anything. She didn't appear to have heard. Oh, I wish you'd do as I say, she wailed. It was just a little prick. The good lady certainly didn't hesitate to ring. She was at me again the next day, and I had to rush out to her cottage. Her message was the same as before. She wanted the wonderful injection which would make those pups pop out, and she wanted it right away. Mr. Broomfield hadn't messed about and wasted time like I had, and on the 3rd and 4th and 5th mornings, she had me out at Marston examining the little doggie and reciting the same explanations. Things came to a head on the 6th day. In the room at Lilac Cottage, the dark eyes held a desperate light as they stared into mine. I'm about at the end of my tether, young man. I tell you I'll die if anything happens to this dog. I'll die. Don't you understand? Of course I know how you feel about her, Mrs. Booby. Believe me, I fully understand. Then why don't you do something, she snapped. I dug my nails into my palms. Look, I've told you. A pituitrin injection works by contracting the muscular walls of the uterus, so it can only be given when labor has started and the cervix is open. If I find it is indicated, I will do it, but if I give this injection now, it would cause rupture of the uterus. It could cause death. I stopped because I fancied little bubbles were beginning to collect at the corners of my mouth. But I don't think she had listened to a word. She sunk her head in her hands. All this time, I can't stand it. I was wondering if I could stand much more of it myself. Bulging Yorkshire Terriers had begun to prance through my dreams at night, and I greeted each new day with a silent prayer that the pups had arrived. I held out my hand to Cindy, and she crept reluctantly toward me. She was heartily sick of this strange man who came every day and squeezed her and stuck fingers into her, and she submitted again with trembling limbs and frightened eyes to the indignity. Mrs. Booby, I said, are you absolutely sure that dog didn't have access to Cindy after the service date you gave me? She sniffed. You keep asking me that, and I've been thinking about it. Maybe he did come a week after, now I think on. Well, that's it then. I spread my hands. She's held to the second mating, so she should be due tomorrow. Would still far rather you would get it over with today like Mr. Broomfield did. It was just a little prick. But Mrs. Booby, and let me tell you another thing. Me name's not Booby. I clutched the back of the chair. It's not? Nah. Well, what is it then? It's Dooley. Dooley. She looked very cross. Right. I stumbled down the garden path and drove away. It was not a happy departure. Next morning, I could hardly believe it when there was no call from Mrs. Marston. Maybe all was well at last. But I turned cold when an urgent call to go to Lilac Cottage was passed on to one of the farms on my round. I was right at the far end of the practice area and was in the middle of a tough calving, and it was well over 3 hours before I got out at the now familiar garden gate. The cottage door was open, and I ventured up a path. A little brown missile hurtled at me. It was Cindy, but a transformed Cindy, a snarling, barkling little bundle of ferocity. And though I recoiled, she fastened her teeth in my trouser cuff and hung on grimly. I was hopping around on one leg, trying to shake off growling little creature, when a peal of almost girlish laughter made me look round. Mrs. Dooley, vastly amused, was watching me from the doorway. My word, she's different since she had them pups. Just shows what a good little mother she is, guarding them like that. She gazed fondly at the tiny animal dangling from my ankle. Had the pups? Aye. When they said you'd be a long time, I rang Mr. Farnan. He came right away, and do you know he gave Cindy that injection I've wanted all along? And I'll tell you, he wasn't right out at the garden gate before the pups started. She's had 7. beauties they are. Ah, well, that's fine, Mrs. Dooley. Splendid. Siegfried had obviously felt a pup in the passage. I finally managed to rid myself of Cindy, and when her mistress lifted her up, I went into the kitchen to inspect the family. They certainly were grand pups, and I lifted the squawking little morsels one by one from their basket while their mother snarled from Mrs. Dooley's arms like a starving wolfhound. "They're lovely, Mrs. Dooley," I murmured. She looked at me pityingly. "I told you what to do, didn't I? But you wouldn't have it. I only needed a little prick. Ooh, that Mr. Farnan is a lovely man, just like Mr. Broomfield." That was a bit much, but you must realize, Mrs. Dooley, he happened to arrive at the right time if I had come. Now, young man, be fair. I'm not blaming you, but some people have had more experience. We all apt to learn, she sighed reminiscently. It was just a little prick. Mr. Farnan show you how to do it. I tell you, he wasn't right out of the garden gate. Enough is enough. I drew myself up to my full height. "Mrs. Dooley, madam," I said frigidly, "let me repeat once and for all." "Oh, hoity-toity, hoity-toity. Don't get on your high horse with me," she exclaimed. "We've managed very nicely without you, so don't complain." Her expression became very severe. "And one more thing. My name's not Mrs. Dooley." My brain reeled for a moment. The world seemed to be crumbling about me. "What did you say?" "I said, my name is not Mrs. Dooley." "It isn't?" "No." She lifted her hand, and as I gazed at it dully, I realized it must have been all the mental stress which had prevented me from noticing the total absence of rings. "No," she said, "it's Miss." Points up the fact that sometimes you feel you are a loser from the start. When you can't even get a client's name right, it is no use trying to prove you are using the correct treatment. When I first came to Darrowby, Siegfried told me that veterinary practice offered unrivaled opportunities for making a fool of yourself. He was right. And that's the end for our story tonight, Mr. Bryce. Just want to tell you how much I love you. I hope you enjoyed the story, and I hope there wasn't too much noise in the background. I hope to talk to you tomorrow. Love you. Good night.
Love you, Bryce. Love you, Bryce. Hey, Bryce. I just want to say I love you.
Alrighty. Good night, buddy.
Good night.
Talk to you tomorrow.